I never planned to work at a crematorium. At 24 years old, with a degree in history that had proven worthless in the job market and student loans demanding payment, I had applied to dozens of positions across every industry I could think of. The job posting for crematory operator night shift at Hillcrest Memorial Services had been one of many applications I submitted without much thought to what the work would actually entail. My name is Daniel, and what I experienced during my first night working alone at the crematorium in September 2022 revealed something that should never have been hidden in the silence of death. Hillcrest Memorial Services is located on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, in an industrial area where funeral homes and related businesses cluster together away from residential neighborhoods. The facility handles cremations for multiple funeral homes across the region, processing an average of 15 to 20 bodies per day across 2 shifts. The day shift, from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., handles most of the volume and includes multiple staff members. The night shift, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., typically processes overflow cases and bodies that arrive late from hospitals or the medical examiner's office. My training had consisted of 3 12-hour shifts shadowing the night supervisor, Gerald Hayes, a 58-year-old man who had worked in the death care industry for over 30 years. Gerald was thorough in his instruction, explaining not just the technical operation of the cremation equipment, but also the legal requirements, documentation procedures, and respect protocols that governed our work. "This job isn't for everyone," Gerald had told me during my first night of training. "You're going to see things that will stay with you. Bodies in every condition you can imagine. But if you can maintain professional detachment and follow procedures exactly, the work is straightforward and the pay is decent for night shift." The cremation process itself is more complex than most people realize. Modern cremation retorts operate at temperatures between 1,400 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, using a combination of direct flame and reflected heat to reduce human remains to bone fragments over a period of 2 to 3 hours. Before cremation, we conduct thorough external examinations to remove any metal objects, medical devices, or jewelry that could damage equipment or contaminate remains. Each cremation requires extensive documentation. We verify the deceased's identity through tags, paperwork, and sometimes photographs. We ensure that pacemakers and other medical devices have been removed, as they can explode in the high heat. We confirm that the family has authorized cremation and that all legal requirements have been met. My first 2 nights of training had been routine. Gerald walked me through 5 cremations each night, explaining every step and having me perform tasks under his supervision. The work was clinical and systematic enough that I could maintain the emotional distance Gerald had described as necessary for the job. On my 3rd night of training, my first night working completely alone, I had 4 bodies scheduled for cremation. Gerald had left detailed instructions for each case, and I felt reasonably confident despite the nervousness of working solo for the first time. The first 3 cremations proceeded without incident. Elderly individuals who had died of natural causes, each with straightforward documentation and no complications. By 2 a.m., I had successfully completed 3 solo cremations and was preparing for the 4th and final case of the night. The body had arrived earlier that evening from St. Vincent's Hospital with documentation indicating the deceased was a 42-year-old woman named Helen Curry who had died from complications related to stage 4 pancreatic cancer. According to the medical records, Helen had been in hospice care for the final 3 weeks of her life and had died peacefully with family present. The paperwork appeared routine: death certificate signed by her hospice physician, cremation authorization from her husband, standard transfer documents from the hospital. Everything seemed in order as I wheeled Helen's body from the refrigeration unit into the preparation area. Following procedure, I unzipped the body bag to conduct the visual identification check. Helen Curry had been a small woman, perhaps 5'3", with graying brown hair and the characteristic wasting that comes with late-stage cancer. Her face was peaceful, showing none of the pain that often marks the final days of cancer patients. I checked her identification band against the paperwork. Everything matched. I began the external examination, looking for any medical devices or metal objects that needed to be removed before cremation. This examination is crucial because pacemakers, insulin pumps, and other devices can explode violently in the intense heat of cremation. As I examined Helen's chest and abdomen, I noticed something unusual. Along her left side, running from just below her ribcage down to her hip, was a series of small, regularly spaced scars. The scars were old, fully healed and faded, but their pattern was strange. They were too uniform, too precisely placed to be from any surgical procedure I was familiar with. I documented the scars with photographs, as we do with any notable features, and continued my examination. That's when I found the first implant. Just below Helen's collarbone on the right side, I felt a small, hard object beneath her skin. It was approximately the size and shape of a grain of rice, embedded in the subcutaneous tissue. I had been trained to identify and remove medical devices like pacemakers and insulin pumps, but this was different, much smaller, and positioned in an unusual location. Using the magnifying light we kept for detailed examinations, I looked more closely at the area. There was a tiny scar, barely visible, directly over the implant. Someone had made a precise incision to insert this object under Helen's skin, but it wasn't documented anywhere in her medical records. I continued examining Helen's body more carefully, now specifically looking for other anomalies. What I found was deeply disturbing. There were 5 more similar implants, one behind her left ear, one in her upper back between the shoulder blades, one in her right thigh, one in her abdomen, and one in her left forearm. Each was accompanied by a tiny healed scar indicating surgical insertion. None were documented in her medical records. The implants were too small to be standard medical devices, and their placement seemed random rather than following any therapeutic logic. They felt metallic when I pressed on them through the skin, and they were clearly intentional surgical insertions rather than natural growths or fragments from injury. But the implants weren't the most disturbing discovery. As I continued my examination, I noticed irregularities in Helen's musculature. Her left leg showed signs of surgical modification, not from any cancer treatment or standard medical procedure, but deliberate alterations to muscle tissue. The modifications were subtle and would likely go unnoticed unless someone was conducting a thorough physical examination, but they were unmistakable once I knew to look for them. Using a small surgical probe from our supply kit, I gently examined one of the modified areas. The muscle tissue had been cut, rearranged, and sutured back together in a pattern that served no medical purpose I could identify. It was as if someone had performed experimental surgery just to see what would happen, then carefully concealed the work beneath healed skin. I spent the next hour conducting the most thorough examination I had ever performed, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. What I discovered suggested that Helen Curry had been the subject of extensive, unauthorized medical experimentation over a period of years. In addition to the 6 implants and muscle modifications, I found evidence of multiple biopsies taken from various organs, far more than would be explained by cancer diagnosis and monitoring. Surgical scarring indicating that tissues had been removed and replaced, possibly with experimental materials. Signs of repeated injections along her spine, suggesting some kind of ongoing treatment or experimental protocol. Modifications to her abdominal cavity that appeared to involve experimental positioning of organs. Evidence of bone grafts in her left arm, where bone tissue had apparently been removed and replaced. None of this was documented in her medical records. According to the paperwork, Helen had received standard hospice care for pancreatic cancer. There was no mention of experimental treatments, research participation, or any procedures that would explain the physical evidence I was seeing. At 3:30 a.m., I called Gerald, knowing he would be asleep, but feeling this situation required immediate guidance. "Gerald, I need your advice on the Helen Curry case," I said when he answered. "I've found extensive evidence of undocumented medical procedures, multiple implants, surgical modifications, things that aren't in any of her medical records. There was a long pause before Gerald responded. Describe exactly what you're seeing. I detailed my findings, the implants, the muscle modifications, the evidence of experimental procedures. Gerald listened without interruption, and when I finished, he was quiet for several seconds. Daniel, this is serious, he said finally. If what you're describing is accurate, someone performed unauthorized procedures on this woman. You need to document everything thoroughly, and we need to contact authorities before proceeding with cremation. Should I call police? I asked. Not yet. First, call St. Vincent's Hospital and speak with whoever is managing Helen Curry's case. There might be a legitimate explanation. Experimental cancer treatment she consented to, research participation that wasn't properly documented. Let's rule out innocent explanations before we escalate to law enforcement. I called St. Vincent's Hospital and was eventually connected to the night supervisor in the oncology unit. I explained that I was conducting pre-cremation examination of Helen Curry and had found evidence of medical procedures not mentioned in the transfer documentation. The supervisor was initially defensive. All of Mrs. Curry's treatments are documented in her medical records. If you're seeing surgical scars, they're from her cancer treatments. These aren't cancer treatment scars, I said carefully. These are implants and modifications that don't appear in any documentation. Can you tell me if Mrs. Curry was participating in any experimental treatment protocols? There was a pause. Let me pull up her complete file. I waited while she reviewed Helen's medical records. When she came back on the line, her tone had changed from defensive to concerned. There's nothing in her records about any experimental treatments or research participation. She received standard hospice care for pancreatic cancer. What exactly are you finding? I described the implants, the surgical modifications, the evidence of repeated procedures. The supervisor's concern grew more evident with each detail. That's not consistent with anything we did here, she said. Mrs. Curry was only with us for 3 weeks before her death, and she was in hospice care the entire time. If she had implants or surgical modifications, they happened before she came to us. Is there any way to determine where she received previous medical care? I can check her intake forms. Hold on. After several minutes, she returned with information that made the situation even more troubling. According to our records, Mrs. Curry's cancer was diagnosed 18 months ago at Riverside Research Hospital. She received treatment there until about a month ago when she transitioned to hospice care. Riverside Research Hospital. The name triggered a vague memory from local news, something about a research facility being investigated, though I couldn't recall the details. Thank you, I told the supervisor. I'm going to need to report these findings to authorities. The evidence suggests Mrs. Curry was subject to unauthorized medical procedures. After hanging up with St. Vincent's, I called Gerald back to update him. His response was immediate and firm. Do not proceed with cremation. This body is now potential evidence in a criminal investigation. We need to preserve everything until authorities can examine her. I spent the remainder of the night documenting my findings in excruciating detail. I photographed every implant, every scar, every anomaly I had found. I wrote detailed descriptions of each discovery and created a timeline of my examination. If Helen Curry had been the victim of unauthorized medical experimentation, this documentation might be the only evidence that would survive. At 6 a.m., when the day shift arrived, Gerald met me at the facility along with our company's legal counsel. Together, we reviewed my findings and the documentation. The lawyer's assessment was clear. We needed to contact law enforcement immediately and preserve the body as evidence. The Columbus Police Department sent detectives and a medical examiner to Hillcrest Memorial Services that morning. Dr. Raymond Foster, the medical examiner, conducted his own examination of Helen's body and confirmed my findings. This is consistent with systematic medical experimentation, Dr. Foster said after completing his examination. The implants appear to be tracking or monitoring devices. The surgical modifications suggest someone was testing procedures or techniques, and the pattern of biopsies indicates ongoing tissue sampling over an extended period. The investigation that followed uncovered one of the most disturbing medical ethics violations in Ohio history. Riverside Research Hospital, where Helen had received her initial cancer diagnosis and treatment, had been conducting unauthorized experimental procedures on terminal patients. Dr. Nathan Pierce, the head of oncology research at Riverside, had been using patients with limited life expectancy as subjects for experimental treatments and procedures without proper consent or oversight. He had justified his actions by claiming that since the patients were dying anyway, the experimentation might contribute to medical knowledge while causing no additional harm. Helen Curry had been one of at least 15 patients who had been subjected to these procedures. The implants were experimental monitoring devices meant to track various physiological parameters. The surgical modifications were tests of new procedures that Dr. Pierce was developing. The repeated biopsies were for research purposes unrelated to Helen's cancer treatment. None of the patients had been informed about the experimental nature of these procedures. They believed they were receiving standard cancer treatment, not serving as subjects for unauthorized research. In most cases, family members had no idea their loved ones had been used for experimentation. The scandal broke in local news within days of my discovery. Riverside Research Hospital was investigated by state medical boards, federal health authorities, and law enforcement. Dr. Pierce was arrested and ultimately convicted of multiple counts of medical battery, human experimentation without consent, and violation of medical ethics standards. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and permanently lost his medical license. The investigation revealed that Dr. Pierce had specifically targeted terminal patients for his experiments because he believed their approaching deaths would eliminate evidence of his unauthorized procedures. Bodies that were buried might eventually be exhumed, but cremated remains would destroy all physical evidence of what had been done to them. Helen Curry's case was discovered only because I had conducted a thorough pre-cremation examination on my first night working alone. If I had been less careful or had followed minimal examination procedures, Helen would have been cremated, and all evidence of Dr. Pierce's experiments would have been destroyed. Over the following months, 14 other bodies were exhumed from cemeteries across Ohio as investigators identified other victims of Dr. Pierce's experimentation. Each body showed similar patterns of unauthorized implants and surgical modifications. In cases where cremation had already occurred, families could only learn about the violations through medical records that Dr. Pierce had kept for his research purposes. The psychological impact on victims' families was devastating. They had trusted doctors to care for their dying loved ones, only to learn that those final months had involved systematic experimentation without knowledge or consent. Several families filed civil lawsuits against Riverside Research Hospital and Dr. Pierce personally, resulting in millions of dollars in settlements. For me, the experience fundamentally changed how I viewed my work. I had taken a job at a crematorium expecting to process bodies according to routine procedures. Instead, on my first night working alone, I had uncovered evidence of one of the most serious medical ethics violations in recent history. The responsibility of that discovery was overwhelming. If I had been less thorough, less willing to document anomalies I didn't understand, less careful in my examination, the evidence would have been destroyed, and Dr. Pierce's crimes might have continued unchecked. Helen Curry's family contacted me several weeks after the investigation began. Her husband, Thomas Curry, wanted to thank me for discovering what had been done to his wife. Helen trusted her doctors completely, Thomas told me when we met. She believed they were doing everything possible to help her. Learning that she was being experimented on without her knowledge or consent has been devastating. But at least now we know the truth, and maybe this will prevent other families from going through the same thing. Thomas showed me photos of Helen from before her illness, a vibrant woman who had worked as an elementary school teacher and loved hiking and photography. She would have been horrified to know what was being done to her, he said. But I think she would have wanted the truth to come out, even if it came too late for her. The case led to significant changes in medical oversight and crematorium procedures. Hospitals implemented stricter protocols for documenting all procedures performed on patients, particularly those in experimental treatment programs. Crematoriums were required to conduct more thorough pre-cremation examinations and report any unexplained surgical evidence to medical examiners. I continued working at Hillcrest Memorial Services for 6 months after Helen's case, but the psychological burden of the discovery never fully left me. Every body I examined, I looked carefully for signs of unauthorized procedures or unexplained modifications. I documented every anomaly, no matter how minor, driven by the fear that I might miss evidence of similar crimes. The nightmares started about a month after Helen's case. I would dream about finding evidence of experimentation on body after body, discovering that the practice was far more widespread than anyone realized. I would wake up anxious and exhausted, the weight of responsibility for uncovering these violations feeling overwhelming. Gerald, who had decades of experience in the field, tried to provide perspective. "What you found in Helen's case was extraordinarily rare," he told me. "Most crematorium workers go their entire careers without discovering anything like that. You did everything right, and you potentially saved other people from becoming victims." But the reassurance couldn't erase the haunting realization that death, which should represent peace and finality, had been violated in Helen's case. Her body, which should have been treated with dignity and respect in her final weeks, had been used as an experimental subject by someone who viewed dying patients as opportunities rather than human beings deserving of care. The ethical violations in Helen's case extended beyond the unauthorized experimentation itself. Dr. Pierce had deliberately targeted terminal patients because he knew their deaths would hide evidence of his crimes. He had counted on cremation to destroy the physical proof of what he had done, and he had nearly succeeded. I left my position at Hillcrest Memorial Services in March 2023. The work had become too emotionally taxing, the responsibility too overwhelming, the constant vigilance for evidence of crimes too exhausting. I had taken the job expecting routine technical work, not expecting to become a witness to systematic medical abuse. Helen Curry's case remains the most significant event of my brief career in the death care industry. It demonstrated that death can be violated in ways that extend beyond the natural process of dying. It revealed that medical professionals, entrusted with caring for the most vulnerable patients, can sometimes exploit that trust in unimaginable ways. And it showed that vigilance and attention to detail, even in what seems like routine work, can be crucial for uncovering serious crimes. The case also raised disturbing questions about how many other cases of unauthorized medical experimentation might exist, hidden in bodies that were cremated before anyone examined them carefully enough to notice the evidence. How many other Dr. Pierces might be operating in medical facilities, using terminal patients for unauthorized research, confident that death and cremation will eliminate all traces of their crimes? These questions have no satisfying answers. Medical oversight has improved following Helen's case and the subsequent investigation, but the possibility of abuse can never be completely eliminated. Some physicians will always rationalize unethical behavior, and some violations will always escape detection until someone happens to look carefully enough to notice what shouldn't be there. What haunts me most about my first night working alone at the crematorium is not the discovery itself, but the realization of how easily the evidence could have been destroyed. If I had been less thorough, less willing to document anomalies, less careful in my examination, Helen Curry would have been cremated, and all physical proof of Dr. Pierce's crimes would have been eliminated forever. The families of his other victims would never have learned the truth. Dr. Pierce would have continued his unauthorized experiments, and Helen's violation in death would have remained hidden beneath the ashes of cremation, another secret lost to the silence we expect from the dead. This remains my most unexplained case, not because of mysteries that could never be solved, but because it revealed crimes that should never have been committed, violations of trust, consent, and human dignity that exploited the vulnerability of dying patients and nearly escaped justice through the finality of cremation.